Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and here on the bench we've got a bin that's undergoing what I refer to as a horizontal migration, which is really just an attempt to depopulate the worm castings of the worms themselves in such a way that you're really letting the worms do all the work. So basically, you just push off the material to the side, set up a nice fresh environment for them, which should be really extremely desirable to them, and they'll go in there on their own, leaving their nice fresh castings behind for you to harvest easily. So we did this already once before in this bin. It was its first extraction 7 days ago, and at that time we had estimated that we had removed about 1,000 worms from here. And those 1,000 worms, they made their way over into that tub on the lower left on the shelf down there. It's the newest of my bins, which actually 1 week ago when we did this extraction and loading of worms into that bin, that was the start of that bin. So that bin's only a week old, and actually since that time, besides the 1,000 migrants that went from this bin to that bin, there was also another migration of another about 500 worms from that bin right there into here. So that bin down there, after a week's time, has been gradually built up to a population of about 1,500. And today we're going to build up its population even more, and that's going to consist of seeing how many worms we managed to round up in this bin over the past week, and then get it set for a reset, basically. Get the food loaded back in here and put it back up on the shelf and let the material continue to depopulate. I did actually put together a quick timeline just to depict what's happened here on this bin. And it was mostly from me, just so I can get my mind around, how things are playing out in this bin, because things are moving very fast, because this bin is populated very densely. I think it's been my estimate that there's probably 3,000 to 4,000 worms in here. So just to summarize, it was up until maybe the 6th week. I think it was exactly the 6th week, when the bin was only 42 days of age, that we decided, you know what, it's only been 6 feedings, but this bin looks like it's full. There's really no more room. We may have started out with a lot of bedding, or maybe fed very heavily, but one way or another, at this point, 6 weeks of age, we decided we're out of space. Time to start, driving this bin towards completion. We allowed another, 3 to 4 weeks for the bin to, what I refer to as starving, but during this time I consider this as feeding, basically. Just because here they didn't eat everything that you've given them up until then, the bin was still, chock full of stuff for them to eat. So this starve period is just kind of a wind down to try to help them get a chance to catch up on all the stuff that's been added into the bin, and let them really deplete as much of it as possible, up until the point where it starts to look like, hey, maybe it's time to move on. And that was maybe, 2 weeks ago or so that we said, hey, let's set up the first migration. Let's start evacuating this bin. And last week's extraction is here, and today's extraction is here. So we've gotten to our second extraction of worms from here. Like I said, the first extraction was an estimated 1,000 worms removed from here. So I guess we'll see how we do today. Let's get a glove on and let's get to work. Frequently I'll revisit my previous week's videos or past videos to try to get my bearings on where things stand, because I'm managing so many bins at the same time. Even though my tracking spreadsheet helps me a lot keep tabs on what things are happening in my bin, it's also very easy to lose track of what's happening. So the videos I find to be very useful in helping me refresh my memory on how things went in the past, so that I can hopefully avoid making the same mistakes in the future. But when I reviewed last week's video, it seemed like everything moved along like clockwork. So I'm going to do my best to try to replicate the way I got things done last week, because it worked so well. And hopefully that'll help us get to the finish line in a lot more efficient way. So the feeding zone here, the way we managed it last week was we just wholesale scooped everything out of there to the best of our ability. And what we had done was we tried to use the cardboard barrier that we had placed in here originally as our marker to show us where the cutoff point was between what we had deemed to be the finished castings and what we had designated as our horizontal migration feeding zone. And At first I couldn't really see many signs of it over here, but as I worked my way down, I did eventually start spotting it. It's right over here. What seemed to work well was simply scooping everything right out of here and placing it into our temporary holding box. It is quite a bit, but I think this box has just the right capacity to hold the amount that we put in here. Or at least the last couple times I did this, it seemed to work out just right. I do have larger boxes, but I think we're going to be okay here. Oops, there I go again. Some of the hazards of using a small box is that you're going to probably spill a little bit over the edge, which is precisely what I just did. Alright, let's rest these little guys down here for a moment. Let's see if we can recoup some of the mess we made here. Number one is trying to help these little guys that are out in the dry air to take cover. So I don't know what we've got here exactly as far as the worm count. So we'll measure it. We're going to actually put this thing on the scale, but only after we've had a chance to give the worms in here an opportunity to squirm down out of the bright light, and then we'll skim some of this partially broken down material off the top as they exit it, and we'll return that to the feeding zone to give it an ongoing chance at breaking down. So while we wait for these little guys to disappear out of view, we'll reload the feeding zone. And part of that is going to be to place in these two little dividers. The ones that we've been using up until now are just so far gone at this point. They're not much of a divider anymore. It's just a flimsy piece of partially eaten cardboard. We'll use it as bedding down in our feeding zone, and there it'll get a good working over when it's mixed in amongst the food. It'll just get depleted 1, 2, 3 by being down there. So I do my best to make sure there's little holes punched into the cardboard. Just make it that much easier for the worms to pass through it. Wouldn't want it to become a hindrance or an obstacle for the worms. Let's get this little guy out of here too. What we're using today to lure the worms is watermelon. Works well, definitely works well. And what I'm doing is just to make sure there's a supply of bedding to go with each bit of food. I use these coffee wrappers. It's a good way to make sure that I include the bedding and the carbon source that they need too. It's a pretty tightly packed package, hardly even fits into the allotted space. Let's see if we can make them a little smaller going forward. Throw some of this stuff in first. Stuff's coming out of the freezer, so some of it's just frozen together, making it that much less formable, if that's the right way to think about it. I'm trying to think now. I believe last time we managed to squeeze 4 of these bundles into here. Looks like we're on track to do the same today. I love using these as a napkin. It's so convenient. Everything I'm wiping off my hands is all edible by the worms anyhow, so why not? Just getting it right back to where it should be, where it belongs. You know, the food is obvious, the watermelon. The other stuff I'm adding, in case you don't recognize it, this is just spent coffee. Used coffee out of the coffee machine. It's already been brewed and used and discarded, so it's perfect bite-sized food for the worms. And the white powder that I was throwing in there, it's not really powder, it's just very finely ground eggshells that I use for grit in my feedings. Grit's an important aspect of the worm's diet. Without it, they can't really break down the food that they're eating. They don't break down the food the way you and I do. They have a little muscular organ called a gizzard where the food gets ground down. But they need a coarse, tiny coarse substance to help with that process. You could use sand, you could use crushed oyster shells, you name it, whatever's available to you. In my case, eggshells are the most convenient and abundant thing that I can use. So we've got ourselves quite a feeding zone here. A whole bunch of watermelon. Pretty awesome. We're going to, I guess we'll start returning some of this bedding type material down into here. That used to be our little barricade. No longer serves that purpose. It's just bedding now for the worms. Another thing that we did last week that worked well was after the worms have had a chance to dive down and leave a lot of this stuff that's sitting here on the top now, we can actually use this again because so much of it is just a bunch of uncomposted either food or bedding materials, all great stuff to go right back down into our feeding zone. You know, we're migrating worms here, right? So if we can make this migration into just worms only, that's ideal. And we just get to hang on to a lot of this great bedding material that's in here from previous feedings. In a lot of cases, it's just this coffee filter, which the food had been wrapped in previously, and obviously there's no signs of that food. But the coffee wrapper, the coffee filter wrapper for the food is still there. Breaking down, clearly breaking down. So it's really useful to have it in the feeding zone for a carbon source to go with their food. It does seem like I could scoop pretty low and get a good handful of this stuff and not take too many worms with me. So let's just do it. Let's grab it. Big chunks of paper in there. A couple pieces of maybe whatever this is, some sort of food left over. Surprising to see. I guess we'll get a better look at what all's in here. You know, if you try to pick through it, you do need to give the worms a chance to dive down. And we've already done that. We've given them a few minutes to do so. We don't need a perfect separation of worms from everything else. I like to leave a little bit of this stuff to go with them as they move to their new space. Just so they're, you know, surrounded by something that's still kind of familiar as far as how it feels, how it tastes. Doesn't have to be such a shock to them as they get relocated. Just kind of taking their bedding with them, taking whatever it is that they're eating at this time with them. But you can see even after just a week's amount of time, they've really done a tremendous job breaking down what was given to them. If you really consider everything that I've scooped out of here so far, that really is everything that was in their feeding zone, not counting the worms themselves. And other than those pieces of paper and those one or two little chunks of melon, maybe a stick or something like this, where I think we're observing the fact that they did more or less eat almost everything that they were given last time. So, still see a couple pieces of larger material down in here, some paper. Just don't want to haul a bunch of our recruited worms out in the process. I really prefer to leave them as part of our migration group. It is at this point though that I'm trying to get a sense of, and I could do it later too, I'll probably have a better view of it later, trying to get a sense of, you know, what the ratio is here between the worms, and the hope is that it's majority of what's left behind here is worms now, and other stuff, you know. So if there's stuff in here that's not worms, then how much of it is that, you know? Is it a very, very small amount? Is it just 5%, 10%? So when I weigh it, I'll use that relationship to sort of try to guesstimate how much of this is actually worms when I weigh it and how much of it is actually not worms. And that's the other reason I like skimming it and trying to reduce it down to, as much as possible, from a practical point of view, reduce it down to just worms for the most part. Let me just do kind of a quick comb through if I can still find any other really large pieces of bedding. I think now would be the last opportunity to really try to salvage it for the feeding zone area back here. Thought I felt something down in here. Might have just been a large mass of worms. So yeah, we got a good haul here. Oops. Curious to see what it reads on the scale. I mean, it is pretty densely packed, but we've also got a fair bit of castings material in here. I think just my initial estimate on the ratio between the two is going to be maybe 3/4 worms, maybe 1/4 other, and then when we weigh it, we can get a better sense of exactly how many worms we've got in this haul here. Gotta love hauling these worms out. Just so much fun having this many worms in your hands. It's got some good weight to it. I mean, a lot of people would start a fresh bin with this many worms. I'm gonna guess maybe 1,000? I do not know. Let's let the scale tell us. Oh, but before we get the scale out, it would make sense to put things away here. I goofed off here for a minute or two, and during that time, even more of this material has been pretty clearly evacuated of worms, for the most part, at least. So we'll just get it back down here into the feeding zone area, and it will even better cleanse our ratio, if you know what I mean. Basically, it'll increase the percentage of worms in this combination here by reducing the amount of castings that we're accounting for by overall weight. All right, now I feel like I'm just unnecessarily returning the worms that have been technically migrated back into the old space, but all right, no biggie. I think we're good to go here. Let's put all this aside, put things away, move on to the next step. In just the short period of time that they've sat off on the side, once again, they're leaving behind a whole bunch of that stuff that is not worms, it's just their environment that they're presently occupying. So like we've done in the past, we're going to give this a quick weigh, and it's a little bit over 1¼ pounds. I guess that would mean I'm pretty much at a pound of worms based on my original 75% estimate, I think. Does that sound right? Yeah, because we scooped off some stuff there at the very last second. So I was thinking that my estimate really needs to be 80%, right? If that estimate is right, then we're talking about a pound of red wigglers here, which I think customarily equates to what most people accept to be about 1,000 worms as far as the count is concerned. So let's get these 1,000 worms into their new space. Instead of having them getting blasted by bright light out here. They must hate it. All right, sorry guys. Let's get this job done. Oh man, it's always so interesting comparing a brand new bin because it's so light compared to an older bin like the one we just worked on. I'm gonna bring you guys just a little bit closer, get a better view of the action. So this right here is something I'm trying for the first time, which is I've actually used a piece of plastic to coat this piece of cardboard. Got my little pull handle here to enable me to just lift it up. So there's a lot of times it just seems like a pain when you try pulling up the plastic off the surface. There's just a tendency for that plastic to flop all over the place and shed a lot of material that's sort of adhering to it and make a big mess. This to me felt like a much simpler way to try to maintain order. You know, the plastic remains attached to the backing here, and I can make sure there's no worms stuck to it before I set it off to the side. I can much more easily handle it. And what we have here is what had been the feeding zone indicator of where the last feeding was. And actually there was no feedings yet, if I think about it. This bin is still running off of its original food supply that was built into the bin when it was originally assembled. So technically after a week's time, some material has already come in here with the load of the worms, some of the uneaten stuff that they were occupying when we rounded them up. But other than that, the bin has not yet been formally given its first feeding yet. So before we drop in our new residents, we'll move this little marker to the side, which is kind of a misnomer because no feedings yet, so that's really, I put it in there because I just had it laying around. It seemed like a good thing to do was throw it in here. So, the moment of truth. I guess we can try to tidy up a little bit around them to see if we can get a better view of how many we've got here, since we already, for the most part, estimated that it's 1,000 by weight. This will enable us to get a sense of what 1,000 worms is by visual sight. You know, what does it look like, basically? Looks pretty cool, if you ask me. And yeah, I guess that's about a pound right there of worms, not factoring in the weight of the plastic container and the compost and food scraps and bedding that they're inhabiting. All right, we've got ourselves a pretty nice little landing pad here. Let's launch these guys off. Did we lose anyone? A little tiny baby worm right there, and another baby worm, very small. Itsy bitsy. So let's see, what are we talking here? Spread these guys out a little bit. If you don't spread them out, it seems like the ones on top just don't even realize that there's fresh bedding right beneath them that they could squirm into. So this just seems to give the maximum number of worms the maximum opportunity to burrow out of sight of these bright lights as quickly as possible. I'm trying to minimize the stress on these little guys, so let's let them chill into their new space, and we'll come back in a minute or two. Well, fast forward a few minutes, we missed a little bit there because I stepped away to wash up on a few things while I was letting these guys squirm away, and came back to the camera showing me that it had run out of space. No big deal. From the look of it, most of these guys have made themselves at home already in their new space here, and that makes this bin that much hungrier. The newest of my bins, 1 week old now, with its third application of worm populations. First one we estimated to be 1,000. The second one was estimated to be about 500, and here again we're at another 1,000. So my rough estimate for what this worm population is so far is about 2,500. And at some point it's going to have to get fed too. But I'm not going to be doing that today. Probably soon, probably in the next couple days. But for now, I just wanted to take care of getting that migration underway and unloading worms and just helping it move along. And the one thing that was very uncharacteristic of me was for me to actually examine the material in that bin after we extracted the worms to see how is it coming along. Are the worms still in there? Are they still heavily populated? Is it mostly castings at this point? Are we close? So it's kind of a mystery building here, since I did not do that probe like I usually do. Like I said, kind of unusual. I knew I'd missed something. I should have made a list. But whatever. That'll just make it that much more interesting to see what happens when we finally get back into that bin to see how things are progressing. So I'll continue cleaning up around here and putting things away, but you know, that's kind of boring. I won't take up your time with that. Let me just really quick say thank you. Thank you so much for sticking around and keeping me company. I always appreciate everyone's comments and feedback, so I do look forward to reading what people have to say. And hopefully you enjoyed the video. And if you did, please, by all means, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye.